Okay, I think I'll go ahead and get us started. Greetings, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Heather Sabin. I'm tourism coordinator here at Monona Terrace Community and Convention Center. I coordinate the Wright Design Series, and this is the first of our spring lectures in 2024. We are very grateful to our sponsors for this program, American Institute of Architects, Wisconsin, and we're delighted to have our speaker tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We ask that you use the Q&A function to communicate with us and not chat. We will be taking some questions following Dr. Ledesma's lecture. And so I will facilitate that. Keep an eye out for the Q&A, and we'll do that immediately following. We are recording the lecture tonight, and should you need to leave us early, or maybe you'd like to come back and do a rewatch, we will post this lecture on the Wright Design Series page of mononaterrace.com. So know that you can go there and do a rewatch or catch up on anything. It's really my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Edna Ledesma. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture here at UW-Madison, and she hails from Brownsville, Texas. Dr. Ledesma is an assistant professor in the department, and the corpus of her research, teaching, and mentoring focuses on understanding the development of the smart, green, and just 21st century city, in particular the cultural landscapes of immigrant populations, microeconomies, and their development of a new understanding of city place. It's not often that we do planning presentations, and I love that we have this one, and I'm so pleased that you're with us here, Dr. Ledesma. I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And it is a real pleasure to be here tonight to share a little bit about my work. So let me just go ahead and get the presentation started. So as Heather mentioned, I am an assistant professor in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture. But I want to talk a little bit about sort of how I got here. I grew up on the border in South Texas in the city of Brownsville, and I grew up in a household where my mom was a community organizer, trained as a pharmacist, but was a stay-at-home mom and did a lot of community advocacy. And my dad was a contractor. And so I grew up around construction sites. And as I was growing up, I loved construction. I loved seeing buildings get built, and I wanted to be an architect. So to be an architect at that time, I needed to go to our main state university, and I went to Texas A&M University. That was 8 hours away from home, far away from the border. And it was a sacrifice. But as I matriculated through my education and sort of going towards that mission of becoming an architect, I realized that there were things that were important to me and my upbringing and my context, my family context, that were at that time really not at the center of my architectural education. We weren't really talking about issues of equity. We weren't really talking about what makes cities thriving environments. We weren't talking sort of at that larger urban scale. And while I fundamentally believe that design is an important component and an incredible tool to make our quality of lives and make society thriving for all, it is a very finite component that needs to be integrated more holistically with other elements. And so as I matriculated through my education and eventually went through to get a master's in architecture, I kept just taking more and more planning and urban design classes and realized that I was hungry for more. And so I ended up having a very wonderful experience as a graduate student, and I got a second master's in urban design and eventually got very connected with the path of researcher, with great mentorship from my professors and my various educators that allowed me to continue into a PhD in urban and regional science. So my view of the world just kept expanding more and more. And part of that was because I was constantly trying to grapple with these kind of broader issues and questions that I think many of us in design and not in design, but just as citizens of the world, are recognized that we are living in very challenging times. You know, we live in the 21st century city and a 21st century society that has built cities that are lacking accessibility. We are living in a world where we are constantly and more frequently confronted with issues of environmental risk and challenges of the climate crisis of today. We have a housing crisis that we have to deal with because many people cannot afford to live in adequate housing or adequate shelter. And in the context of the world that I grew up in the border, there are issues related to geopolitical boundaries and separation that are part of our daily lives and experiences in our cities, at least in that context. And so, you know, as we frame that challenge, right, the idea that there are a lot of challenges in our lives and how we build our cities, we also have this sort of exponential what if and question of what are we going to do in having to reconcile what the COVID-19 pandemic did to us as a society and also has done to us in our understanding of the built environment. And so what the COVID pandemic did was really helped us recognize that, well, we already knew that change is constant. We know that change can happen really quickly. And to some extent, fundamentally, what planning is as a profession is having the ability to manage change. How we might be able to go about doing so is something that I think we are still trying to address. And we have to be thinking about the element of time, is how we address change and address problem solving, something that needs to be a temporary versus a permanent solution. And then can we extract lessons of what we saw during the COVID pandemic into trying to understand some of those broader issues I addressed in terms of relating to the climate challenges, social inequality, etc. And so, as I mentioned, you know, I think one of the reasons why I kind of steered further into the planning world, I think, is because planners are very well equipped to sort of manage uncertainty. And we are the assets to the community to be able to navigate change. What we know is that change is now happening a lot faster. And so in order for us to be, from an academic perspective, you know, what I tell my students is we need to be able to be well equipped and to train our future professionals to be able to be literate in strategic foresight. And that means that as a trained planner, as a trained designer or landscape architect, you need to be able to be agile to recognize that while we might be planning something today, if there is something that you're going to be putting into a 10-year strategy, recognize that within that 10 years, a lot can change. And so in order for that plan to be more robust, we need to be able to integrate, and we need to consider the integration of diverse perspectives. We want to be thinking about executing strategies that are both fact-based and inclusive. And as we think about what technology is going to be able to do at the forefront, we think about the challenges of being able to manage AI and these advanced technological tools. Can we use technology to our advantage to be able to solve problems quickly, but also make sure that the solutions that we're presenting from a planning and design perspective are people-centric? We're not excluding particular perspectives in the community, but we're thinking holistically about connecting the needs of the community to the solution. And so one particular component of how we might consider the future of our cities to be changing is we can even just sort of splice in the context of proposals. We can think about how land use might change. So, when we're thinking about societal trends, we want to be thinking about what are people's ideas of what they want to do for socializing? Well, that might change in the context of a global crisis. What are the technological trends? What are the economic trends, the environmental trends, and the political trends that are going to inform how people choose to build or preferences around where they or how they want to be located relative to where they work, etc. Right? So this is sort of the average conundrum of what it means to be living in a society, right? Trends are always constantly reacting to, our preferences are being reacting to the trends around us. And I think an important trend to consider that we have just, and as we're sitting here today, I was telling Heather, I think it's incredible that the digitization of our lives allowed for so many more opportunities. So this lecture 5 years ago would have been offered, and I know many of them could be offered in an auditorium where people come and they sit and we all get to socialize together. But being able to open up the door and being able to offer this presentation virtually, that opens up the opportunity to access to information. I saw in the chat there is somebody here from Florida. I'm sure there are people from across. If you want to add, I know Heather asked, if you want to add to the Q&A where you are from and what area you're representing, that would be great to see. So that's an incredible asset to be able to open up through our technology access, right? So an inclusive and equitable city gives people choices. And in this case, we have the choice and the ability to connect virtually. But at the start of the pandemic, we realized that that wasn't actually the case for many people, right? It actually left out not having access to technology, not having access to the internet, excluded students or people that may not have access to the internet to be able to then function and fulfill those basic educational needs. For some of us, we were able to quickly transition from working in an office to working from home easily. Some people, unfortunately, could not because their work required them to be physically present somewhere. And so what does that mean in terms of having equitable choices for people? Well, in the context of how we plan and build our cities, we have to recognize that this really opened up our door to understanding that where we live could at any point also be where we work and where we play. And so what are the implications for that, how we design our houses to be able to have that flexibility and the diversity? We're seeing there is a trend for across the country that there is an excess of commercial space that people are not leasing because people can work from home. And what does that mean then for the type of real estate trends that we are wanting to keep our local economy stable, right? There's a lot of implications for, building and designing things to be one thing. Well, maybe what we need to learn moving forward through these particular trends out of the pandemic is that having flexibility is the key, because we don't know what kind of challenge we're going to be confronted with in the context of the way we use our spaces. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think, an important takeaway out of what we just experienced, and, we're not completely out of it. COVID is still around, but I think we've learned to live and exist with it. But we've learned many things. And one particular thing that is important in terms of looking at the city from an equity lens is that we were not prepared. We were not prepared to deal with change that happened really fast. And so this was really a dry run to other things that might be ahead. And so what I want to talk a little bit about today, this was really kind of framing the context of today's conversation, is What are the things that I take away and bring to my students as we start to think about designing through an equity and inclusive lens for our communities? And I want to talk a little bit about what are the elements that I think are important for us to consider. And so the first thing from an urban design perspective is we have the ability to implement plans within the public realm that fundamentally are able to provide safety and security in our streets. So what does that mean? Safety and security for who? Well, we want our streets, primarily what our streets have done, at least in the 20th century, they were able to move cars from point A to point B. They got us from our job to our house, from our house to the store. But streets were always historically vessels for conversations, vessels for interaction, important nodes for businesses to thrive. And so streets need to really be centers and arteries in our city that are able to do that. There needs to be a hierarchy in how we move larger systems, larger mobility systems, but also we have to think about centering that mobility also from a humanistic perspective. And how do we make sure that streets are safe for children? Streets are safe for the elderly. And thinking about elements that could be designed within our streets that allow for that. The sidewalks, lighting fixtures, so that if people are walking at night, they're able to feel comfortable and safe to be in that space. As we're thinking about where we're going to house people, we've got to be thinking about being able to provide and build homes that are affordable and robust. And affordability is a huge issue. If we constantly build, we're seeing this across the nation, this idea to densify, of course, and we're building apartments that nobody can afford. I mean, I live in Madison, it's a college town, and I don't even know how my students can pay the rent that they're paying for apartments that are just beyond what I think we all assume we pay when you go to college. It's not accessible, and it's not accessible for a lot of people. And so how could we be able to integrate planning strategies that can begin to address the lack of affordability? And robustness really kind of addresses the fact that, a house shouldn't just allow you to have particular luxuries or accessibility, such as quality of light or quality and accessibility to certain amenities, just because it's a particular access point in terms of an economic access point. Homes should have access to amenities, and those amenities, as I note, should be accessible to all. Well, what is an amenity? An amenity could be a park. An amenity should be me having the ability to live in an apartment that I can then walk down the street and be able to buy a gallon of milk without having to get in my car. It's the idea that I live in a place that is interconnected. And then as we think about developing across our cities, where are we choosing to develop? We are constantly confronted by challenges or climate crisis. If we're building in a place that is going to be introducing more impervious surface through the introduction of materials and concrete, then how do we make sure that our ecological programming can also be doing, as well as the architecture could begin to be sensible and connected to environmental performance features. And those environmental performance features shouldn't just be accessible to communities that are affluent. That we got to be thinking about how we have through urban planning strategies have constantly put the urban poor near the more toxic, the more vulnerable sites. So protecting communities that are marginalized from those particular conditions. And as we see in this example, this is a case study in Stockholm. It's called Hammarby Josted. And this particular community was actually built on an environmentally toxic site. This was an old shipwreck yard that was just a complete guck of pollutants. And what they ended up doing is they scraped the land. You can't see it on here because there's no 3D component, but this park that you see on the right side, This actually is a huge hill. So they scraped about a foot of earth so that they could clean the ground, build on top of that. And that pile of earth became actually a wonderful ski slope. So that's a big social space for the community. This whole community is net positive. So it actually manages all of its performance features on site. It collects water, waste. And in addition to that, it's built around hubs. So it's built around a school, it's built around social spaces, and it's connected to the city center. As you can see here, where there's a tram that goes straight, the metro that goes straight into the downtown. So while it's not in the downtown, it is connected to the city center via public transit. And so what's important here is that this particular community really centered itself around social places for communities to gather, in addition to doing the important environmental performance aspects of it. So, we talk about this ideal of what it means to build an equitable city, but the reality, this is an image of the east side of Austin, Texas. This is a place where I lived for 12 years before moving to Madison. And, we talk about, building walkable, dense, this is probably something we would see in any city in America. We're seeing these densified 2-3 story, 3-4 story developments, but a lot at what expense are we building this? And in this case, this was development that was happening on the east side of town, predominantly what was historically a redlined neighborhood of predominantly African American community. And what you were seeing is that the businesses that had been there for years could no longer afford to be there. So planning has a role in ensuring that we can be able to have our cake and eat it too. And one of the challenges of that is that the economic models through which we function sometimes don't allow for that. So how can we get creative? I want to talk a little bit about a project I worked on with my students. And one of the beautiful things, and I was mentioning this to Heather earlier, is that, it is a privilege to be in the academy and to be able to talk about these issues with students and to dream about improving and solving the problems of our world. I know that in the reality is getting out there, there are so many complicated components to be able to balance, and that's what planning is. But what we do with our students is to be able to train them to be able to dream and connect the possibilities of change through values that are important to improving the problems of our communities. And so this is a map just for context. I am currently here in Madison, Wisconsin, but I'm going to talk a little bit about a project I had an opportunity to work on and the privilege to work on back in 2017 in Brownsville, which is my hometown. And so I do want to kind of provide some context. Brownsville is a border city. It has a sister city of Matamoros, which Brownsville has a population of about 200,000, which is, I think it's similar to Madison, and Matamoros is like 2 million. So it's 10 times, or is that 10? I don't know. Yeah, I think it's 10 times the amount of people. And so you can just tell just by looking at this graphic that the density is just complete contrast, the amount of people that live on one side versus the other. And so in 2017, I do want to kind of mention sort of the challenges of, these two sister cities divided by a river. We talk a lot about sort of the geopolitical challenges of building a wall. Well, our border wall, the definitive edge of our boundary, our wall has been there since 2013, 2012, since, before, Ted's been there for 10 years or more. And so the wall has had various evolutions. This is one version of the wall that was built originally right at the downtown. But the wall as it's being constructed today this is a picture taken a couple of years ago. And the territories that the wall is now expanding onto are right on the edge of the river outside of the urban centers. And while this is perhaps an important safety concern, I think the challenges here is when we think about it from a planning perspective, is that ecological challenges that this particular piece of infrastructure is now confronting and disrupting at the river. So one of the beautiful things of the Rio Grande River is that it is actually a migratory resting stop for birds that are coming from Canada. They stop at the mouth of the river in Brownsville and in that South Texas region, and then they migrate and make their way down to South America. So birding and bird watching is actually a huge component of ecotourism and supports our local economy. We have many wildlife refuges that are preserved, and these ecological treasures are being challenged by the construction of elements such as what you're seeing here. Just another picture. And so in 2017, I was at the time at University of Austin and doing a very similar work to what I do here at University of Wisconsin. I was invited to bring a group of students to participate in what had been sort of an ongoing challenge. And the challenge was, what you see here in the yellow is an 8-mile long, 100-foot wide easement that was and had been an active rail line. Union Pacific ran what was a historic rail line that crossed over into Mexico back in the early 1900s. In 2012, Union Pacific decided that, the city had grown. There were neighborhoods, actually this area here is my neighborhood where I grew up. There were areas of the city that were constantly kind of challenged by freight traffic that was stopping and going and just disrupting the flow of the daily lives of people. And so what Union Pacific decided was, we don't really need to go that way anymore. We don't need to be in the city. What we're going to do is reroute and make our way down through this side on the left and kind of bisect and go around the city. And so part of the agreement, Union Pacific actually didn't own the land. The land was owned by the county. Well, everything that you see here that's developed is within the city boundaries of the city. So you have sort of a planning challenge where you have a 100-foot wide easement running straight to the city, and the city has no control over it. So what does the county want to do? They've kind of have this wonderful real estate opportunity that's coming to them, and they want to build a toll road. Well, north of this yellow line is a highway that already does exactly what that toll road would have done. And so the neighborhoods and community advocates all came together and challenged what they believed was not a very 21st century approach to how we address mobility in the city. What they wanted was a rails to trails network to be able to increase bikeability, increase health, and the daily quality of life for the citizens. So when we were invited to be at the conversation in 2017, they had been in talks for 5 years about whether they would build a road or not. And the question wasn't, should we have trails or should we have road, which was a key component. The challenge was, we don't know, we don't have a vision. We don't really know if we could develop this land, what would be the opportunity. And people wouldn't, it was very black and white. And so we were invited to come in as a university to work with local stakeholders and local planners, work with different agencies. There was national support from the National Rails to Trails Conservancy. We worked with the community college and really tried to think about how to design this corridor from a more holistic perspective. So we brought our students down and we had a series of public engagement sessions at the local farmers market. We worked hand in hand with the community college students. Many of the community college students live in that neighborhood. In those neighborhoods, they could benefit from that corridor being integrated into their daily commutes. Or some of them even lived across in Mexico and they wanted to see the possibility of being able to cross in that same path over to the U.S. and then do that whole commute using hike and bike infrastructure. We came in at really kind of building on a lot of inertia that was already present in that community. And that really allowed us to really think big. And we had the research, we had the data, we had all of the comments and the feedback that the community was pushing for. And we had an opportunity to meet with the developers that owned much of the land that was contested and was the points of contention related to where they wanted vehicular access versus not. We were able to present data for traffic counts to see what was appropriate in terms of a vehicular road intervention. And then ultimately, those same principles that I described earlier is the lens through which I have my students address some of these questions. So I mentioned a lot of people were sort of convinced that if you introduced a vehicle into this corridor, they would be doomed. And we've made them understand that a vehicle doesn't have to be a bad thing. A vehicle could be a BRT or a bus that can work hand in hand with a bike, hike and bike corridor, but it actually helps people move up and down from the east and west side of the town. We were able to think beyond this corridor and recognize that by connecting this artery, we're then restitching across neighborhoods opportunities for micromobility, opportunities to connect to amenities, to be able to think about safe routes to school, and present visions of what that change could be. In addition to that, we were able to introduce and bring a conversation forward about infill. Not only could this corridor be able to facilitate the movement of people through a more health-oriented approach to mobility, but we could think about housing infill for the elderly or for families, or opportunities for entrepreneurial hubs where you could start a business and park your food truck next to the corridor. And at the same time, we're thinking about amenities that are important to the community. As I mentioned before, this idea of bird watching as being an important economic driver for this area. So those amenities being important for the entire community. And thinking about addressing environmental risks. So the housing that the students proposed began to think about possible flood risks and how could the adaptation of blocks, so granted these weren't specifically in the corridor, but in adjacent neighborhoods, thinking about adaptability of those blocks to be able to address flooding risks. And so ultimately, what I really bring to my students and what I hope you can take away from this conversation is that in order for us to really address equity in the city, we have to think holistically about how mobility, housing, economy, ecology, all of these systems are all connected, and we can't design one without thinking of the other. And so this coupling and this relationships, that is at the core what we do in planning. It is the kind of thinking that is important to design, and design is important to planning, but we can't decouple them from one another. And so once you kind of have this template of opportunities, that is when you allow for the unfolding of the social fabric in the city. And so I do want to kind of mention that out of this project, I mentioned that this conversation began in 2012 with the collection of signatures from the community and the collective action to really have a conversation around doing something that was more community oriented. And we were invited in 2017 after we presented our projects to the public. There was an MOU signed by the city and the county. They were able to secure federal funds. And then eventually the groundbreaking took place after the pandemic in 2021. I'm really happy to say that this was a great milestone for the city. Their ideas, while not everything that was in our plan has been executed, the ideas were planted, and we were really able to help move the needle forward in this conversation. I'm happy to say that my mom, she's there in the middle, she was part of that group of people in 2012 that began, knocking on doors and collecting signatures to say that this corridor could be something else. So I'm very proud of this project because it's a project that is very near and dear to my heart, but also, we came in to support a broader initiative that the community helped move forward. And this is just a bit of the logos of the partners that were involved. I do want to add a couple more things. I'll talk a little less, but quickly, about a similar project we've done here in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin in 2022. I had the opportunity to work in the city of Chicago with the Resurrection Project, and to bring my students here. I'm working with students in the master's program of urban planning and in the undergraduate program in landscape architecture. And we work jointly to address these very complicated issues. And we were working with the Resurrection Project, which is a nonprofit that really tries to address issues of housing and security and issues of gentrification in an area that is highly gentrified in the neighborhood of the Pilsen neighborhood in the city of Chicago. And what we were working with, a similar project, it was a Rails to Trails project that was spanning two neighborhoods, Pilsen neighborhood and the Little Village neighborhood, both predominantly Latino neighborhoods, but also neighborhoods that, as you can see, are in the crux of really an environmentally challenging industrial relic of a city. So this is the Rust Belt, and many of these are still active industrial sites, but around them are neighborhoods of working class communities that are being displaced and also changing. And so the students looked at the development of a plan for a Rails to Trails corridor that has been, this one is actually 20 years in the making. And so there was a lot of distrust from the community around what would happen, if anything. And so it was great to partner with a nonprofit that has been the voice of the community and that trusted us in this process. This is just one of our partners giving us a tour of the site, and us looking at another. This is the 606, which is another Rails to Trails corridor that was kind of the foreshadow of what could happen, but the neighborhood wanted something different. And so just quickly, some of the things the students were really interested in, and I think an important layer of this conversation around equity is a model that's called a just transition. So a just transition looks at transitioning environmental sites or environmentally disrupted sites with around issues of equity. So looking at how do we bolster our community assets, fostering a transition that was centered on equity, connecting people to places, and thinking about the health of that community. So the students looked at strategic infill opportunities across the site. And then I thought this was a really wonderful scenario that they outlined. If we're going to be having to deal with these kinds of challenged sites, environmentally toxic sites, one of the best tools that we have at our hands is an ecological restoration process through the integration of new vegetation. And so in this case, the students worked collaboratively to design a new planting strategy that over the course of 20 years, you could see the evolution of the introduction of new trees into the site, all done through a collaborative and a co-op in the neighborhood, that over time, this increase in tree canopy could be the sponge in remediating the site. And so the introduction of, at the same time, what is at the core of what we were doing is the introduction of a hike and bike corridor, but a hike and bike corridor that could do more than just move people from A to B. And working with the values and the ask of the Resurrection Project, addressing issues of housing affordability. And so lastly, the last few minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about beyond the classroom. One of the key components of what I do at the university is research related to food systems and marketplaces. I'm the director of the Kaufman Lab for the Study and Design of Food Systems and Marketplaces, which is an honor to do. And because this particular lab was founded to honor the legacy of Jerry Kaufman. He is a leading scholar. He was a leading scholar in food systems research in the field of planning. And we take a lot of pride in carrying his name and our legacy. And one of the main tools through which we do that is through a toolkit called Farm to Facts. So what we do is essentially it's a citizen scientist approach to data collection at farmers markets. And so through Farm to Facts, we work with farmers market managers to collect what I like to call farmers market census, where we tend to profile what is the ecological and social and economic performance of a market. A lot of the work that we do is contracted through USDA awards. We serve as an evaluator, and we tend to really react to the needs of the market. So over the last 10 years, we have worked with over 100 markets. We are a very interdisciplinary team. We have students from across the university in computer science. We've got anthropology students. We've got landscape architecture, marketing, graphic design, and we have collaborators at other universities as well. This is just kind of a quick timeline of where how we began. We began through a USDA grant back in 2014. We're about to reach our 10th anniversary. And just to show you kind of our reach, we operate in all of the states and Canadian provinces that you see on this map. And what you see in the red, this darker red, we actually just became a partner with the Rodell Institute as part of one of the USDA's $25 million awards for a climate smart research project. And we're specifically working with farmers market and farmers, 600 farmers and 30 markets in the Southern Piedmont region to try to understand and market this new concept of climate smart, and the recognition that through our agricultural practices, we can make a dent in reducing our CO2 outputs and cleaning of our environment. And so it's a huge challenge, but it's a wonderful challenge to be a part of. And this I already covered, but I do want to say an important component of that is doing that through a measure of our ecosystem services. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that in a minute, because I do want to leave some time for a Q&A. This is just kind of a listing of the various projects with which we are involved. And we are operating with multiple USDA grants across the country. And I'll finish by saying that I know that this is a project this is a presentation that has invited our partners in AIA Wisconsin, but I think if you are an AIA member, please get involved with the AIA, because it is important that through our service, we can enact change. And I had the privilege through the American Planning Association, so a similar professional organization on the planning side, to be an active member and first in various capacities. This last year, I finished my work in my service as a board member. But through my involvement, I've had the opportunity to engage in various projects, one of which I'm very proud of is this project that is the Planning for Equity Policy Guide. I invite you to please take a look at it. And it's a wonderful contribution to giving a set of tools and guides for how to do this work. So I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, I have all my controls going here. Thank you so much, Edna. That was wonderful. It's great to hear about the big ideas that you're wrestling with our planning students. I just as a kind of a housekeeping item, how would you suggest that people access that planning for equity document? To go to APA's website?
Yes, and actually, I believe it should be accessible to the public, but so just search for Planning for Equity Policy Guide, and you should be able to download it. I'm not, I can't guarantee it, but I don't think it's locked to just APA members. I think it's open to the public.
Okay, great. I certainly would take you up on your offer to talk a little bit more about the Farm to Fax. Do I have the name right? Farm to Fax program.
Yeah, no, so I feel very lucky because, you know, I didn't talk about specifically about my dissertation research, but the work that I did before coming to Wisconsin, I studied markets extensively. That is sort of one of the core components of my research is the study of markets and marketplaces. My dissertation looked specifically at Latino markets and markets on the border. I did some case studies in South Texas, in Houston, in Los Angeles, and San Diego. And as I was immersed in that work, I realized that a key researcher, a leading scholar of that research was Dr. Alfonso Morales, who actually is here at UW. And through some not so random, but you know, I got an opportunity to work on a project with him, and we collaborated on a research initiative out of Stanford University looking at the economic performance of Latino businesses across the country. And we're sitting in a room, and you know, he mentions like everybody that's part of this consortium, tell us what you want to get out of this group. And I said, I want a job. Because I was doing a postdoc. I was at UT. I said, I want to work at a university. I'm on that path. And he reached out, and you know, he was my idol. I mean, I read his work, and I was so lucky to just say what I wanted. And he called me a year later and said, we want to hire someone, and would you come and interview? And so you know, I had been reading and being immersed in his work, which he studied markets since the late 80s. And he got an opportunity to work with Jerry Kaufman here at UW and founded the lab with him. And then soon after, Jerry unfortunately died of cancer. And he really took to heart sort of carrying his legacy. And so I came in, you know, 5 years after he had started the lab, and we worked hand in hand to really grow the lab to be what was, I think, at that point, a lot of great ideas. They were the beginning of the development of the ecosystem services tool. The farm to fax component had just launched, but it was basically, how do we then convince markets that this is a way to empower them? So a lot of our work has been relationship building and really providing markets with the capacity to do the work. We bring students to the markets to do the surveys. We write the reports. We share that knowledge, and we think that the power of what we do is in storytelling. It's in elevating the voice of the markets and the market managers, because many times markets are understaffed, undersupported, but they're great community connectors. And how do we, as a university, take our tools to be able to help them tell that story? So that's a huge privilege to be able to do that. And so we've been lucky that in addition to be able to do that, it's come with funded projects. So we're able to hire the students and do the work and do really robust research that is actually having impact on the ground.
And are you tying to all kinds of indicators of economy and health and
Yeah, so we do. And a lot of times the community or the specific grants have a very unique objective. And so one example I can give you, in central Wisconsin, we're just wrapping up a planning grant that is looking at working with 6 markets, 3 markets that have a SNAP EBT they offer SNAP EBT at the market and 3 that don't. And so we're looking at evaluating how this is that the ones that offer it are able to sustain that program, and those that don't, what are the customers saying? Would they benefit from having that? We look at GIS data to look at where our customers coming from. Are we actually servicing underserved populations versus not? How much are people spending? And we can show, based on what people tell us on our customer surveys, if they're spending $20 every week, here's the economic impact over a full season. So it's really exciting. And so the tool itself is able to do all those calculations in the back end for the market managers.
Wow, interesting. Our audience is quiet. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Ledesma they'd like to type into the Q&A? Madison being home to, I think we tout ourselves one of the country's best farmers markets.
It's the biggest. It's one of the biggest. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. And also considering it's pretty cold a lot of the times here, it's a pretty robust market.
Right. Bread and cheese right now, but we're crawling our way towards spinach and cold crops. And
microgreens.
Right. Interesting. I'll give it just another minute and be quiet here in case somebody would like to type a question in. These are all really, it's, so much of planning is systems, and it is it's a lot to take in. And I think sometimes it's a little bit hard to focus in on just one aspect of this. So
no, and I mean, I think what I tell my students, the hard thing about doing that work is that you've got to be able to think broadly in the systems, but also think like, okay, what kind of bench would be the best bench? Like even down to the details, right? How does the bench have a role in the bigger picture? So that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, when you get down to designing unique features of parks and things. Absolutely. Perhaps we have a quiet audience tonight.
That's okay. That's okay. I really appreciate you all's time. And I think that I'll just share my screen again and say, there's my email. So if anybody wanted to do a follow-up or send any notes, please feel free to do so. I always welcome any feedback, and feel free to stay connected. I know it's I see a little thumbs up. It's great. I was like, it's kind of floating. I really appreciate you all taking the time to be here. And as you mentioned, Heather, these are really big questions, and I don't intend to have the answers, but maybe I hope that if it was provocative, that I did my job. I made you question, maybe I could go and do this thing or get involved or talk to my city planning, group, or, go to a meeting and make sure that if I have power, I use my power in a positive way.
And then the great words. We're seeing reactions to that on screen, and in the Q&A box here too, I also see thank you for the presentation. I want to mention that we did find you through the Badger Talks service of UW-Madison. So just a big thanks to Maya and that office whose mission really is to bring, if I understand correctly, faculty and staff to
the community.
Public, the big Wisconsin idea. And we benefited from that tonight, which is lovely. And one more shout out to AIA Wisconsin, our sponsor, for sponsoring these lectures that we'll have through the spring. So folks, audience, keep your eyes peeled for a presentation in late April and another one in mid-May. I won't share details yet, but they are in the works. How's that for a teaser? And Dr. Ledesma, thank you so much for your words tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Have a good night.
Thanks, audience. Good night.